So let me greet all of you who joined VSA Online. So hi everyone, and today it's my pleasure to host a talk by Pouya Bashivan from McGill University. Uh, and well, without any further delay, Pouya, please. So introduce your talk and go on.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Evgeny. My name is Pouya Bashivan. Hello, everyone. I have a research lab at McGill University, as Evgeny said, and my lab mostly works on computational models with a focus on neural network models to simulate neural activity, simulate behavior, mostly in primates, specifically in humans, and across now a relatively wide range of different behaviors. And today, I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in relation to the hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, and specifically in terms of models that can make inferences based on episodic memories. And before I begin, the work that I will describe was spearheaded by these two students, Zihan He and Maxim Daigle. And the talk consists of two parts that you will see. It has a flow between the first part is more neuroscience inspired, and the second part is more computational modeling. So before I start telling you about our research and our findings, let me motivate you with an example. Suppose you're entering a building for the first time from this door to this building, from the top side of the building. And as you're walking in through this to this building, you start making observations as you're finding your way around. You enter the building, turn right, and then you see a hallway in front of you, and then you move, and then there you find the elevator that you were looking for in order to go to other floors. And now suppose a week from then, now you happen to come through the same building through another door, a side door, and now this time you take a different path. You go through, you take the steps, you go into the main hall, and then you go slightly to the left, and then you find the stairway, and then you climb the stairway up to the second floor that you wanted to go. Now, another day, maybe a month later, again, you enter the building from the north door, and now you make your way through to the elevator that you were expecting where you can find it. But now you find that this elevator is now out of order. And you start wondering how you might be able to get to the stairs that the other day you found when you entered the building from the side door. And now the two properties of this sort of behavior that seemingly we are very fluent at doing it without even thinking about it is that, first of all, this behavior is really complex. It may have looked somewhat easy because I was showing all of these images on an allocentric representation of this building, its map, the two doors, the relative position of those doors, and so on. But if you really think about it, what we do in practice is that whatever we do in terms of finding our paths and making predictions about what we'll see at every turn is purely based on egocentric information. So this is what we really have access to. And we don't have any of the things that I'm showing you up here. And another really important property of whatever computations in our brain enable this sort of ability is that we're really good at integrating information across episodes that may span days or even months, sometimes years. And we are really good at putting them together into a coherent map that enables us to make predictions or find shortcuts and so on. Now, the part of the brain that it is believed to underlie this sort of behavior and our ability to solve this sort of task is called medial temporal lobe. And medial temporal lobe consists of multiple different brain regions. Two of the most well-known ones are entorhinal cortex and hippocampus that are famously associated with grid cells and place cells that were the result of findings from Moser's lab and John O'Keefe's lab that not too long ago, they received the Nobel Prize for those findings. To give you a little bit more perspective in terms of what place cells specifically do in hippocampus, I'm showing you this video that tracks a mouse as it goes around in this open arena. It's like a real box. It's a little box that the mouse has access to. And what they're showing is, as the mouse is going around, they're showing with little red dots the points in space in which a single hippocampal neurons that we're recording from was fired. And as you track these sort of activations and you put them together into a distribution like the one that is being shown right now, it becomes very clear that these neurons, there are many similar neurons that have been found over the years in areas CA3 and CA1 of hippocampus that seemingly have very sharp selectivity to specific parts of space, whatever space that the animal is exploring. And these cells have been found, as I said, in two areas called CA3 and CA1 in the hippocampus. And this encoding of spatial information or spatial tuning have been taken as evidence of spatial encoding in this area, and has been the basis of what people have been thinking about as hippocampus as the brain structure enabling spatial navigation, spatial representation. And you might expect that because these cells are coding for different parts of space, so they should enable the animal to exactly know where it is in space. And in fact, research from different labs, originally from Matt Wilson's lab, or led by Matt Wilson, showed that when they recorded neural activity from mouse's hippocampal cortex, hippocampus, they could accurately decode the location of the animal at every instant, but also use it to kind of predict whether the animal is planning ahead or thinking about the trajectory it has just traversed, and kind of doing different sort of computations in space. Now, over the years, even though people started by making a lot of observations about spatial tuning in the hippocampus, over the years and more recently, people started reporting other sort of tuning in hippocampal cells, some of which I have included in this slide, things like encoding positions of interest, such as bed or nest of the animal, encoding the reward location, when the location of the reward, very importantly, changes in space from trial to trial, and also other things like completely position independent, place independent, things like sound frequency, when the task of interest is about the frequency of the sound and its relationship with reward, and other things such as social coordinates in humans. And importantly, all of which are completely non-spatial factors that have been shown that are also encoded by neurons in the hippocampus. Now, another interesting study in that space is a study led by David Tank's lab, in which they hypothesized whether cells these in the hippocampus purely encode spatial information or encode other factors, such as the accumulated evidence during an evidence accumulation task, and or on the contrary, it could be a combination of both. And in their results, they showed that when they recorded from many cells in the hippocampus, the population code in the hippocampus truly encoded both position and evidence across trials from the neural population in the hippocampus. But also, when they looked at individual cells, they found that most of these cells actually encode these mixtures or conjunctions of spatial and non-spatial factors in the task. So kind of putting a stamp of approval for this conjunctive representation in the hippocampus as compared to spatial representation only. Now, the story gets a bit more confusing as I will tell you about this paper from Stefano Fusi's lab, in which they looked at neural recordings from mouse hippocampus, very similar to the other study that I was showing you from Matt Wilson. And now this time, as they were building these decoders so that they can decode the animal's position, from neural activity in the hippocampus, they started to look at how the usefulness or the importance of different neurons is for predicting the animal's location is related to its spatial tuning. And they ranked all of the neurons they were recording from in terms of the importance of each neuron in informing the animal's position from that decoder. And now when they looked at the spatial tuning of those cells, they found out that, quite surprisingly, some of the best or most of the best cells that are most informative for decoding animals' position actually didn't have very clear spatial tuning. And vice versa, some of the worst or most of the worst cells that were least informative about animals' position actually had quite clear spatial tuning. So this actually meant that spatial tuning and spatial information may not be necessarily the same thing. And you might ask, then what is the significance of spatial tuning if it doesn't matter much for encoding spatial information? And what does it tell us about the neural code that underlies the hippocampus? So what I've told you so far mostly fits into hypothesis one from this three set of hypotheses. The first one is that what hippocampal neurons are doing is that they are independently encoding spatial information or non-spatial information, or they could be also encoding a mixture of these different types of factors in the task. But alternatively, we also hypothesized two additional hypotheses here. One was that perhaps what's happening is that spatially tuned neurons are neurons that are encoding mixtures of spatial and non-spatial information at the present. So they're encoding perceptual information, what the animal is seeing. That includes the animal's inferred location, as well as other non-spatial information, such as reward and so on. And vice versa, non-spatially tuned neurons may be just, in fact, be tuned to past information or prior mixture of spatial and non-spatial information. And as a third hypothesis, it could totally be the case from the perspective of what we know experimentally, that even it would be possible that all of these cells are jointly encoding present information, but they're using different sort of functions that differ in terms of their level of nonlinearity. For example, some of these cells at the heart may be encoding this information with linear mixture of the different features, or some of them may be mixing them with nonlinear functions. And what we wanted to know was to see which one of these hypotheses actually may be true about hippocampal coding. So to do that, we teamed up with Dr. Martinez Trujillo's lab and some of their trainees, Roberto Gilly and Benjamin Corrigan, in which they had macaques doing a version of associative memory task, which involves spatial navigation in virtual environment, as they were recording from their mid-posterior hippocampus. And to give you a better idea, I'm showing you a clip of some of these trials that were run by these animals. As you see, as the animal enters the corridor, the texture on the walls changes into two textures, wood or steel. And then the animal has to pick a color when it reaches the end of the corridor, in which the reward associated with each color is determined by the association between the context and option colors. This association, importantly, changed every day that the animal was doing the task. For example, if the animal was seeing the context wood in the corridor, it meant that color orange would have the highest reward, followed by green, followed by purple, and vice versa for the steel context. And when they looked at the data, they found that, in fact, a lot of the neurons that they were recording from CA3 had very significant spatial selectivity, spatial tuning. And most of these neurons actually had one or two place fields. Classically, people expect to see place cells to have a single place field. But in this case, a lot of cells actually had two place fields. And you might ask why. And when you look at the place fields associated with these cells, it quickly becomes clear that many of these cells had symmetric spatial fields. That was somewhat understandable in the context of the task that the monkeys were performing. And because of that reason, the two sides of this maze, this X maze, actually had very similar value associated with them. And when we looked at all the neurons that were being recorded through the sessions that they were in these two animals, we found that almost half of these cells were passed as spatially tuned cells, and the other 47%, almost half, were non-spatially tuned. Now, the first thing we wanted to know was the fact that how much spatial information actually is important for the information that these cells are encoding. So one way to do this is to use spatial information itself, if we know where the animal is at every point in time, to use that information to try to predict the neural activity. So if a neuron purely encodes spatial information, then having access to only spatial information should be sufficient to predict its activity. What we did is that we performed that analysis after we separated our neurons into two different categories of spatially tuned and non-spatially tuned. And what we found was that actually the spatial information was somewhat good at predicting some of these neurons. It's mostly spatially tuned neurons, not so much for non-spatially tuned neurons. But overall, the accuracy of predictions that we were achieving, which was measured by correlation, was pretty low. Less than 0.6 in this case and less than 0.25 in that case. Now, the next thing that we did was that we asked, what about if we include all of the task relevant factors that we have access to? Things like visual information, reward, and decision. And we repeated that experiment in order to predict neural activity from those factors. And this time, what we found was that these linear conjunctions of these factors actually quite improve our predictions of many of these spatially tuned neurons, but not so much for non-spatially tuned. And on the other hand, a lot of the non-spatially tuned neurons actually remain largely unpredictable. As you see in these plots, the highest prediction accuracy that we achieved for non-spatially tuned neurons was about 0.4, but for spatially tuned neurons, we actually approached 0.8. Which overall, it meant that the linear combination of factors may be a good model of the computations performed by these spatially tuned neurons, but not so much for non-spatially tuned neurons. And when we also looked at the weights assigned to each of these factors in predicting different neurons belonging to each of these two categories, we found out that both of these neurons, actually, neurons in both of these classes, are best predicted by mixture of these factors, effectively meaning that all of these cells underneath, they are mixed selected. But one thing we know about the brain is that almost nothing is linear in the brain. So why should hippocampus neurons be? So we wanted to go after that question, but it's really difficult to find a good nonlinear model of hippocampus. So the model that we decided we're going to work with was a recurrent neural network model that would perform a similar task to what the macaques were performing during the experimental setup. As you remember, there was a X maze with options on the two sides and context in the middle. So we simulated that environment with a kind of simple setting in which the agent would go through this X maze somewhat in a similar procedure like the animal. And then the goal of the agent would be to maximize its reward or its return. And this was an embodied agent, meaning that it would take actions, move in the environment. It would make actions, pick its actions based on purely egocentric observations, like what the animal was receiving. And the model itself, it was a nonlinear and recurrent neural network model. So it consisted both of those computational motifs. And we were training it to maximize the reward. And after we finished training, we used a similar paradigm to what I talked to you about with the predictive model, in which this time we combined the unit activity in the neural network model at every time instance with linear combination or linear mixture of those features in order to predict neural activity in each of the neurons that we had at every point in time. And we showed that overall, for many of these neurons, the model could do a really good job in predicting the activity of those neurons, in which I'm showing you here is the x-axis is time, the y-axis is the predicted firing rate in red, and the actual one in black. And each point here would correspond to the monkey spending some time heading to a particular direction in a specific part of the environment. When we looked at these cells, again separated by whether they were spatially tuned or non-spatially tuned, we found out that the gap between this linear model, the ideal observer, and the nonlinear model was much higher for non-spatially tuned neurons compared to spatially tuned neurons. And this plot here actually shows all of the cells that we had in this data set, which shows a clear the divergence between these non-spatially tuned neurons versus spatially tuned neurons. And the natural question that comes after is what factors actually are contributing to this better explanation of non-spatial neurons. So this model had several differences with the linear model, the ideal observer. It was receiving egocentric inputs instead of the factors. It had nonlinearity in it, it had recurrence in it, and it was also task optimized. So we ran a couple of different tests in order to isolate what is the key difference between these two models that enables this model to really predict so well the activity of those neurons. And long story short, we found that the critical factor here was the nonlinearity in the model. And in order to isolate that, we ran an experiment where we replaced this nonlinear recurrent model with a linear version of it, with linear recurrence. And we trained this model to also perform the same task with reward optimization as before. And we found that this model actually either matches the performance of the nonlinear model or even exceeds sometimes the performance of that model. And now we use the unit activity in that linear model in order to predict neural activity. But this time we found, quite surprisingly, that the ability of that linear model to predict neurons was almost the same as the ideal observer, which was a linear model, and was much lower than the nonlinear recurrent model. And when we looked at the distribution of the predictions across all the cells that we had, we observed that these two models, ideal observer and RORN is a reward optimized artificial recurrent network with linear recurrence, these two models were almost exactly overlapping in terms of the predictivity of the neurons that they had, meaning that like these two things actually give rise to the same or very similar representation. And long story short, what we found when we looked at individual selectivity was that in a linear model with a linear recurrence, almost all of the units in these models are spatially tuned, and there are no spatially tuned neurons. But on the other hand, in models with nonlinear recurrence, we get different distributions that contain both spatially tuned and non-spatially tuned neurons. So this already kind of provided some support for our third hypothesis, which was stating that the difference between spatially tuned and non-spatially tuned neurons may be solely on the basis of the computations that they're performing, whether they're linear or non-linear. But
can I ask a question?
Yes.
So when you say like the position of the animal, are you just saying like an X and Y value? Or are you making like more like a place field map?
Good question.
Because yeah, they would have different effects, right?
Yes. So let me go back to this slide. So this is slide 15. I'll remember that. The spatial location we have in mind is each of these boxes. So we have 9 options for spatial location. So in the plot that I was showing you here, the values that go into these lines, you would have 9 such features, each corresponding to one location. When that value is 1, it means that the animal is occupying one of those 9 locations.
Okay,
So
yeah.
those are the features that we're using to predict the animal's brain activity.
Okay, thanks, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so back to what we were talking about. So what factors actually contribute to, yeah, so I think we already went over this. Yeah, so what is the functional role of nonlinear recurrence? I think we were here. So we wanted to know what is this nonlinear recurrence in practice maybe doing that is causing these non-spatially tuned neurons to emerge in the units of this neural network model. And there might be a lot of different hypotheses. The one that we were specifically looking for, based on the literature that we were aware of and its the relationship between hippocampus and episodic memory, was that perhaps what's happening is that this recurrent processing is really critical for encoding memories, for mnemonic representations. But how do we test that? We wanted to get a measure of how much information about present and past information exists in each of our neurons. So in order to quantify it, we ran another similar analysis to before, in which this time we predicted neural activity at every time point t from the features or the task factors that we had access to at prior time points. So for example, we predicted neural activity at time t from the features at time t-1 or t-2 or t-3, and we did this for up to t-30. And then we at every time point, we looked for every neuron how well such a model could predict the neural activity. And we divided this whole time period into different periods that we called the green one, which was the present information, perceptual. If the peak of this curve happened to reside within that period, meaning that that neuron's activity could be best predicted from the current information about what the task and the animal's position is. If that peak happened to be positioned within this period, the purple period, we called it a distant memory neuron. And if it fell into this middle ground, which was up to 7 time steps before, we called it near memory. This roughly corresponded to about 1 trial before, and distant was about a couple, 4 or 5 different trials prior to the current trial that the animal was at. And we saw a somewhat balanced distribution between perceptual and memory neurons in our neural recording data set. So now what we wanted to know was that how well that neural network model, the nonlinear neural network that we had, could predict neurons that now belong to each of those categories. So we did it based on perceptual, near memory, and distant. And what we observed was that this nonlinear recurrence was actually critical, much more critical for these mnemonic encoding, and was becoming more and more important as these neurons were encoding information farther in the past. And again, to link this to the original hypotheses that we started with, this particular result provided some support for the second hypothesis that temporal context may actually be one of the critical other factors that differentiates between spatially tuned and non-spatially tuned cells. And so far, we talked about this mnemonic encoding and spatial encoding separately. But if you look at them jointly, you find that most of these distant memory neurons are actually non-spatial cells, would satisfy this non-spatial selectivity cells. And most of the perceptual neurons would actually pass as spatially tuned cells. And in fact, when you look at these two factors jointly, you see that most perceptual neurons are more spatially selective, and most mnemonic neurons are less spatially selective or non-spatially selective. So to put it all together for the first part of the talk, we started from this classic view of coding in the hippocampus that was telling us is purely spatial selectivity, meaning that these neurons map onto spatial axes of information and no weighting on non-spatial axes. And then this view was updated later on by this alternative selectivity that there might be some cells that are spatial, some cells that are non-spatial. And then more recently, it was updated to this mixed selective view that cells actually have weighting on both spatial and non-spatial factors. And now what our work tells us is that these neurons actually all live in a continuum of encoding, which on one side, we have these perceptual neurons that are linearly coding. And on the other side, we have these memory neurons that are encoded with nonlinear functions. Now, to get back to the original behavior, the example that I gave you, now we talked a lot about representation in the hippocampus. But now one other question that we wanted to pursue was what computations actually give rise to such representations. What we saw from that example was that we were like two of the key properties of whatever computations may underlie our ability to solve these tasks is that we have to be able to make inferences based on egocentric information. And also we should have some sort of mechanism to integrate information across different episodes, different sessions, different exposures that may be spaced in time by days or months or even years sometimes. So the first thing we might want to start with as a particular computational framing of what might be happening at the hippocampus is the version of the model that we used in our first study in order to kind of get some insight into what computations might be happening. Those would be linear or nonlinear recurrent neural network models that in our case, we were training them to maximize return, kind of to make a model that would predict actions given observations so far. And another related type of model is a model from Blake Richards' lab that was recently proposed, again, recurrent neural network model that instead of maximizing reward, it was trained in order to kind of simulate transition dynamics through enabling the model or training the model to make predictions about the outcomes. For example, given state observations in sequences and knowing the actions that the agent will take, predicting the outcome of choosing those actions. But these models, both of these models, one of the limitations they have is that they solely rely on slow learning in their weights. This actually prevents these models from being capable of rapidly adapting to things like environmental layouts or object place associations, which are really important for being flexible in real world. So another really well-known model is this model called Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, which is based on ideas from Tolman and Eichenbaum as the model suggests, but it also has close ties to what Eichenbaum was thinking about, the neural processes or computations that may be happening in the hippocampus. So the way they think about what the medial temporal cortex or hippocampus might be solving these sort of tasks is by kind of dividing the behavior into two parts. So computation-wise, it has two parts. And they envisage that the medial part of the entorhinal cortex learns a sort of structural code that encodes information about the outcomes of choosing actions in a general manner. For example, one of the examples that they speak about is that if you start from one point and you go to the east side and then go to the south, go to the west and go to the north, then you would expect to have returned to the same location that you started with. And this structural code that the model learns effectively learns to path integrate over the actions that an agent may take in the external world and update an internal representation of its location on the layout of the environment. And then the lateral part of entorhinal cortex brings in information about sensory observation. And the hippocampus now, its role would be to learn a conjunctive code that puts together this structural information about where the animal is in space and the sensory observations that the animal would expect to have to make at those locations in order to make predictions about sensory observations as a function of actions taken. So the two parts, just to put it in other terms, the first part is the medial entorhinal cortex slowly learns transition dynamics in some latent space of the model, and then the hippocampal part uses Hebbian weights with rapid learning in order to quickly memorize the association between locations within the environment, the layout, and sensory observation at those locations. So in this case, because the model is using fast weight, it actually enables the model to rapidly adapt to new object place associations like this example. For example, if the structure environment is the same, but some of the objects move around from one time to another time. Now, if we contrast these two models together in terms of some of the three critical properties of a model that we think really hippocampus or medial temporal lobe is enabling us. One is that it should be able to quickly adapt to sensory changes, like the one that we talked about. But it also should be able to quickly adapt to structural changes. For example, what if I add some obstacle is added in the environment, some wall is added to some room. We should be able to quickly adapt to those changes and fixing or updating our predictions accordingly, and also being able to integrate temporally distant experiences across different sessions that might be spanning days or months. Now, clearly, the recurrent neural network model, because it was solely relying on this slow updates or slow learning, it would not be able to handle any of these situations, right? It would have to update its weights in order to learn new associations between sensory and structural information. It also needs to do new updates in weights in order to encode new environments. And also, it would not be able to quickly integrate information across episodes because it relies on sequential information. On the other hand, TEM, Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, can well handle adaptation to sensory changes and also can integrate information across episodes, but struggles, or we predict they would struggle in order to adapt to structural changes, because specifically that information in TEM model is encoded in the weights of a recurrent neural network model. So ideally, a model that we would be looking for that would pass all of these three things, what we hypothesize is that such model should solely rely on fast weights or rapid learning to infer both structural layout and sensory observations if we wanted to pass all three. And our hypothesis or our model that we're proposing is a model that would predict the outcomes from a set of transitional episodic memories. So the way that the model would work, just tying this back to the example that I started with, is a model that, first of all, it consists of a memory bank in which each of those memories consists of a transition, a triplet of starting state, an action taken, and an end state. So we are assuming that there are a set of such transitional memories available. And then what we want the model to perform in terms of its task is that, given, for example, a current state, what I see right now, egocentrically, as well as an action, a hypothetical action that I may want to take to predict what the outcome of this action and that state observation. And kind of to put it briefly, what we do is that we pass on both of these pieces of information to a neural network model, and then we ask the model to make a prediction about the expected state after taking that action. But that prediction, importantly, should be extracted by putting together or binding all these transitional memories that live in the memory bank. Now, an interesting property of this model, such a model, would be that now if the query that we're giving to the model matches one of the previously observed queries or one of the previously observed memories, which you have encoded in your memory, then this problem becomes a recall problem. You want to remember, you want to recall a past experience. But if such a memory does not exist in the memory bank, then automatically this becomes a prediction problem or an imagination. Now, in practice, what we trained the model was in an environment in which we considered the environment somewhat like a graph, in which every node of this graph would be mapped onto a spatial location, and then the links or the edges of this graph would correspond to transitions. And the way we train this model is that we randomly generate a set of edges for this graph, in which it would make in the main case that we train the model, those edges form a minimum spanning tree of the graph, such that with minimum number of memories, the model can observe every state within the environment. But importantly, the direction of these edges are purely random, so they do not form sequences. And these forms are the memory bank provided to the model. And then we query the model with one of three types of queries. We either give it the starting state and action and ask it to predict the end state, the end observation. We give it two states, beginning and end. We ask it to predict the action, or we give it the action and the end state, and we ask it to predict the starting state. And we pass all of that information onto a neural network model that the main architecture is a transformer architecture, multiple blocks of transformers, but we also tested when we replaced this with different sort of recurrent architectures. And in the output, just like how I explained before, we asked the model to make predictions about the missing information in the query. So now to test the model, we primarily had two settings. The first setting was designed so that we probe the ability of the model to kind of adapt to structural changes. For this, we trained this model in an environment we call random wall. So each time the model was given a trial to solve, we would randomly assign state values to every spatial location, and we randomly put a wall in a random direction and part of the space. And we train the model on many millions of such arrangements. But then at test time, we test the model on a new setting in which the wall arrangement was unseen, as well as the association between the states and spatial locations were also unseen. And now we test different variations of our model called ESWEM, Episodic Spatial World Model, and as well as different variations of the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine in blue. So in ESWEM, we considered these orange colors correspond to transformer variation of the model. We also had an LSTM, a recurrent neural network model version of ESWEM in purple, and also a Mamba, which is a state space model. And pretty much everything was the same, except that the transformer block in these models were replaced by Mamba or LSTM. And we compared them in the three modes of predictions: predicting source, predicting action, and predicting target. Because TEM was previously only tested on predicting target, we only tested it on predicting target. But overall, the finding was that the transformer models were much better at doing all different variations of the task, and they were getting better and better as we increased their depth. Mamba model was the next in line, somewhat on par with the 6-layer transformer model, much better than LSTM, and TEM model was substantially lower than all variations of ESWEM model, which was kind of expected from what we hypothesized or what we started with, which is because of the need for slow learning and recurrent weights in TEM, we had expected it to struggle in terms of adapting itself to new structures in the environment. Now, another environment we tested this on, we called it open arena. This case, we didn't have any walls, but the main difference was that the set of states observed during training were entirely different from the set of states used during test. So at test time, the model would observe state values that it has never seen before, regardless on top of the random association between locations. And this time again, what we saw was that the transformer version of SVEM did pretty well again in all version variations of the task. But this time, the Mamba and LSTM version of the model were much lower in terms of their performance. And also TEM was somewhat in the middle, approaching between 0.3 and 0.6 performance in terms of accuracy, almost 60%, 30 to 60%, much better than before, but still much lower than the transformer version of SVEM. And another test that we ran was that, as I said, when we were training these models, we were always training them on minimum spanning tree memory banks because we wanted the model to have access to the minimal information accessible from the environment and not to give it extra memories to make the task easier by finding shortcuts through memories. But now we tested this model on some out-of-distribution non-minimal memory banks in which at test time, we gave it more memories than the minimum spanning tree. And what we observed was that as we were giving this model more and more memories, the model was actually getting better and better at solving the task because it could find better solutions or easier solutions to the queries that we were giving. So there is one plot that if you're interested, you can ask me about it. I put it in supplementary. I can show it to you later, in which we show that if we add more informative memories to the memory bank, the model gets better. But if you add non-informative memories, then it would not perform so well. And what happens to the representation? So far, it was all about behavior. So the first thing that we observed was that when you looked at the latent space of the model, it actually closely replicates the geometry or the layout of the environment in an open field like below. But also when we added environmental obstacles such as walls or pillars at different parts of the space, the latent space of the model quickly adapted to the new layout and kind of reshaped itself to reflect the layout of the new environment. Now, one other thing that you might ask is that now we kept talking about this world model. You might ask, what does this world model enable? So I show you two things that you can see the details in the paper. One thing is that we show that this model is actually very easily could be adapted into a model that can very efficiently explore an unseen environment. And this could be achieved by simply make the model follow its least certain predictions and go through all the space, adding each one of them. So importantly, starts from an empty memory bank and then keep adding each of the transitions into its memory bank as it moves on. And when we compared it with some baseline, we saw that it almost reaches to the ideal observer exploration agent and also much better than a navigation agent based on episodic memories called episodic planning network. And another interesting utility of this model is for navigation, in which if you want to go from point A to point B, now you can use your world model to kind of represent every location within the environment from your memory, and then planning your path within the latent space of the model, which again we showed could lead to navigational agents that either are on par or even better than navigational agents from episodic memories such as EPN. Now, two last things, we also showed that we could scale this model to more complex and realistic settings. For example, this setting where the agent receives egocentric information that are not scalar values, but observations from an environment with depth. and we showed that the model could still perform similar tasks in that environment from egocentric actions. And while the network does that, again, the latent space of the model very closely follows the layout of the environment like before. And also more recently, we showed that we could scale this to even more realistic environments, such as this case of 8,000 training on 8,000 indoor scenes from high dimensional inputs, 224 by 224 image inputs, and semi-continuous action spaces that we can still show that the model can perform well under these settings. And the final thing that I want to show you that is, this is very recent, not included in our publications. So we talked a lot about selectivity of these neurons in medial temporal lobe. And we already know about different classes of these cells, such as head direction cells, grid cells, and place cells, that are found each at different parts of the medial temporal lobe. So one natural question would be, do these sort of cell selectivities emerge in our model as well? And the answer is yes. We found cells with selectivity to head direction, grid sort of patterns of selectivity, as well as place selectivity in the layers of our SWM models. But perhaps more interestingly, would be where we find these cells. We found that most of our head direction cells actually emerge in the early layers of the neural network model. Grid cells emerge within the middle layers of the neural network model, and place cells start to emerge and ramp up towards the last layers of this neural network model. Now, to take you back to the original example, so we started from this kind of motivating example of having experienced different parts of an environment across different sessions. And then we said that one of the property of the computation or the computational goal of such a system would be to be able to make predictions about the outcomes of actions taken in an environment by putting together episodic memories to form a map such that it enables such a prediction in practice. And what I would frame this as would be to predict from transitional episodic memories. And again, I want to restate this this fact about the model is that in this framing of the model, recall effectively becomes a prediction when the queried value or the queried information was previously seen. So when it was previously observed query, it becomes a recall problem. And when the same system is being queried with and previously unobserved query, it becomes a prediction or imagination problem. And with that, I'd like to thank my team, specifically Maxim and Zishan, who were working on these two projects in my lab. Also, our collaborators, specifically Dr. Martinez Trujillo from Western Ontario, that very generously gave us the data to work with and worked with us to make these happen. And also,
yes. Sorry, you should finish your
no, I'm done.
acknowledgements.
If you're interested about the papers, I've included the QR codes so you can quickly access them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Pouya, thank you very much. It was very informative and rich on details talk. So now I open the floor for questions. So, well, I have some on my own, but let's see if we have some people from neuroscience. So, Paxan, please. And Ross, Paxan, you first.
Okay, yeah. Well, I guess I mean you're here at the VSA meeting and you say things like conjunction and binding and you talk about nonlinear, but you know, like to us, conjunction and binding mean something particular, and so I'm wondering if you've thought about those ideas, and I guess the difference is kind of like, you know, when you say nonlinear here, you're talking about like pointwise nonlinear neurons in a recurrent neural network, but when we talk about something nonlinear and conjunction and binding, it's more like a multiplication operation or an outer product operation. And so then you get, something a bit more like explicit in terms of, what does it mean to make a conjunction? But then it's also very nonlinear. And so I wonder if you've, thought about that or looked into that.
Well, to be honest with you, as I was telling Evgeny before the meeting starts, I'm not, unfortunately, very well versed in vector symbolic analysis. So if you would tell me more about how you think these differ, I'll be happy to explain more. But or I can just explain or clarify what it mean, like what I mean by using those terminologies, like nonlinear
Well, yeah.
computation. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, I think you described a bunch of things that are like the ideal observer, where you're doing just a weighted sum, and of course, that's what linear means, and then what you call nonlinear is really like a linear nonlinear kind of neural network idea where it's pointwise, and um, but like what happens in a recurrent nonlinear network isn't exactly explicit, I guess. Like it's not really clear what nonlinear function you're computing necessarily. And often I see what I call poor man's multiplication, where you use this linear nonlinear kind of operation to just do more like when we do binding or when we make a conjunction, it's more like taking an outer product of the feature spaces, and so then you'll have a real conjunctive neuron. So then, it's like if it has a place field, but then it's also about a decision, then, its receptive field is really the product between its place and its decision kind of preferred feature. And so if either one of those things is missing, then the neuron will be, completely inactive. And it's only when both are present, the neuron will be active, and there's no like halfway being active, right? And so in an additive sense, like if the neuron had some position and some decision features, then, if one of them was present, then it would be like halfway active, right? And so then, yeah, we often use this conjunctive operation, and then this is what we call binding. And so it's just a different type of nonlinearity that we think is valuable. And then when you say things like conjunction, this could be explicitly modeled like an outer product instead of like through what this recurrent nonlinear network is doing.
Yeah, I see. So maybe I should clarify. So conjunctive in the analyses we ran, when we could talk about mixed selectivity or conjunctive coding, it was pretty much putting different weights on different factors and then adding them up. The reason
Right.
for that was that we were using a linear function with set of weights per factor. When we
Yeah.
were talking about nonlinear, it's just we have almost no way of knowing what the computation turns out being. We
Yes.
know what the computation at every step of the way is, but there are two things that really makes it complicated. One is that, like in the case of the neural network model that I was showing, I could go back to the slide. So what we were giving was egocentric information. What the network was seeing was not seeing symbolic information, right? It had to first learn to extract what it found to be informative features from those pixel values. That's what it would do. And then once it extracts that information internally, it would pass it on now to this recurrent nonlinear model, which has several components. It has its own internal memory. It's an LSTM. I didn't go into it. It's a long short-term memory. It has an input gate. It has forgetting gate, and it also does feed-forward computations. So there are multiple things running on the same input that it receives for every time step. And then this cascades over time across multiple steps, right? And all of which, if you want to write it down in a closed form, it just becomes very complicated. Might be ways to kind of simplify them to try to see what sort of simpler computation is trying to approximate. We have not done so. We did a little bit of work trying different methods for like mech-interp, mechanistical interpretability in these models, but we didn't really find anything that was clear cut enough so that we can say something really abstract about the computation. So it turns out that we just left it as is without going after trying to simplify it in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the downside of trying to use like big neural networks and deep learning to, predict neural responses is you end up having a black box kind of explaining another black box, and then it's a little bit like lost about what kind of insights you have. And
That is true. That's true, but we still care a lot about these predictive models, specifically in my lab, because my lab is more or less an engineer lab. And what we want to do with these predictive models, hopefully in the future, is to use predictive models to elicit control. If you have good models that can predict simulate activity at time, every time by time step, then we should be able to use it to kind of either design experiences that would make neurons that we're recording from before behave or respond the way we want them, or to guide different sort of stimulation in order to kind of steer the neural activity within the neural manifold. So that's why still we think this is of value, even if the insights, as you're putting it, the insights are not very clear so that I can just communicate what are these neurons doing with you in a matter of a couple of sentences.
yeah, that makes sense. But I would just, yeah, encourage you to think about, really what we mean by binding and by conjunction features in our context. And because like if you were to be able to make a good predictive model, it's much more transparent, like exactly what you're putting together. But then, binding and addition like become this combinatoric like compositional problem. And so you then, would need to explore kind of another type of space of like how are features combined via either addition or by multiplication. And so, yes, but it would be a little bit more clear cut.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ross,
Howdy, thanks for that.
hi.
Yeah, I'll continue on with Paxton's theme there, if I may. So back in slides, I think it was 24 through to about 26, where I think you first mentioned binding. You're essentially representing the task in terms of ordered triplets of values. So these are
Yeah,
your
either
episodic
on these
memories.
slides, you think, yeah,
Yeah.
these slides.
And so then later on, yeah, then you're saying, okay, we can query those triplets with any pair of values to get the other one back. That kind of operation is bread and butter stuff in vector symbolic architectures. And we do those things without any learning necessary at all. You just basically get that kind of behavior for free because of the algebraic properties of these representations. But sort of amplifying on what Paxton was saying, the focus of the analysis tends to shift from individual neurons to the vector of activities across the entire set of neurons. And so you sort of you're rethinking your representation and thinking in terms of the entire pattern and what the entire pattern means. But this is the neat thing about this is you get these properties without any learning necessary. So that sort of raises the prospect that you might be able to do what you've been doing so far, but without having to rely on these expensively trained recurrent neural networks. So one possibility, I was wondering whether it'd be worth replacing your recurrent neural network with a reservoir system. In which case, you're building up your nonlinear representations just through the unlearned dynamics of the reservoir, and then having your readout be a linear readout from the nonlinear representation in the reservoir, which raises the possibility again that you might get, because it's a linear operation, a much more rapid update. And then tying that back to the VSA world, you can look at what a reservoir is doing and describe that in terms of the representations that it's building up. So, trying to break open that black box that Paxson was talking about earlier. And then just going one step beyond that, but perhaps a bit further away. Well, actually not so further away from VSA. If you were, it was around about slide 16, I think, where you were talking about predicting the states of the neurons from past values of the known features. You may have come across a thing called predictive state representations from some while back. And Rich Sutton over at Alberta, I think, was heavily involved in that. And this notion is that if you've got some sort of an agent interacting with an environment, the only information available to it is purely egocentric, as you've been saying. So essentially, you've got a trajectory of sensory motor information. So it's action, observation, action, observation, action, observation, all from the point of view of the agent. And what he was arguing, these predictive state representations are essentially, instead of your state as represented in your neurons being a summary of the past sensory motor trajections, it's actually predictions of future sensory motor trajectories. So, for example, if the state is there is beer in the fridge, that's represented in terms of, I stand up, I turn around, I walk to the kitchen, I open the fridge, I look in, I see beer. And that's a prediction. So I wonder, whether you might try doing that analysis there with those predictions, with future values from the feature space rather than past. And
Thanks
I seem
for
to
the
recall,
comment. This one, maybe I respond here. This is something that we were thinking of doing for a long time. What we ended up doing was that I could not convince the student to do this before we submit the paper. And what happened was that we submitted the paper, and one of the main comments that came back was exactly what you're saying, which is you investigated whether there are predictive features in the latent space of the neural network model. This is something we're doing right now. Right now in my lab, we're doing a lot more of analyses of different types of neural network models, including SBEM that I talked about in the second part, but also this reward optimized neural network model in terms of what other sort of features emerge, and also comparing it with the model from Blake Richards' lab, Levenstein paper, that I briefly mentioned it when I was talking about SBEM here. This model was trained to predict sensory observations in the future. So one of the things we're doing right now is to contrasting representation of each of these neural network models in terms of their selectivity to population measurement of population activity in hippocampus to see whether there are more predictive type of features in the Levenstein model versus the model trained on reward optimization. Also comparing this with episodic type of models like EPN and SBEM. So this is what you're doing. I think your comment had all where you were continuing with some other things.
No, I was just two things there. And one is I was just going to bounce a thing off of Paxson. I think Dilip George, gave a seminar at Redwood Center where he was talking about grid cells, and I think that he made some comment along the lines of that, experiments with rats where you introduced an obstacle or you changed the size of the arena while the rat was there, actually changed the spatial tuning of the cell. So essentially, the notion was that it was representing something like distance to the wall. If you shifted the wall, then its tuning changed. But the other point, again, back to this uh, particular seminar, is that one of the things that is, VSAs are really good at representing entire sequences. So again, it might enhance the explainability of what you're doing if you're thinking of if you could encode all this information in a VSA-like representation rather than sort of a point-like neural representation.
Mhm.
And at that point, I'll get out of your face.
No. Maybe I'll respond to the first point that you raised, reservoir computing. So in our hands, what we see is that if the computational problem is simple enough, we can get reservoir computers to do the task for us, so that we don't have any training in the recurrent part, and we just train simple readouts from them. When the tasks become more complicated, especially like in settings that I was talking about here, in these two settings, where you could have like really large possible space of problems that you need to solve. Like there could be any wall anywhere, there could be any sort of association between states and location. With reasonable size of those models, we can't solve these problems. Ultimately, we need to have some sort of learning in the model in order to kind of optimize the weight so that reasonable size of model can perform the task in such level of generality. So that would be my comment in my response to your comment about observer computing. And in terms of your last comment, I think it was also related to what Paxton was saying, that kind of improving interpretability of what is it that the model is doing. So far, what we've been trying to do, especially with SVM more recently, is to go after two things. One is to see whether we get similar single neuron similarities, single neuron tunings, and also population level responses. Like a lot of the work that we do in the labs, like we're taking measurement from the brain as the ground truth, and then we use it to benchmark different alternative models that we have. In this case, we have TEM, which is kind of more explicitly doing a set of computations that I think is closer to what you guys are thinking about. Like TEM has a recurrent model that only does path integration, and then explicitly has a lookup table in the form of a Hebbian memory that can select sensory observation from its memory. So what we were trying to do was kind of like get TEM, get SVM, get recurrent models, and see now how well can they each predict brain activity. That would be our way of showing how close we have come to representing what's happening in hippocampal neurons. And in terms of what are the computations and what are they doing underneath, we're still kind of taking the first steps, taking some of these neck-interp methods that people are using to identify different paths within this giant neural network model, and then assigning function to different nodes within the path, within the circuit, and then trying to explain what the circuit as a whole might be doing. But we are very early on those steps right now.
Thank you.
More comments from the neuroscience part of the audience? Well, I have maybe, sorry if it appears to be naive, but and I'm kind of reflecting on what we talked before the seminar about the biological plausibility. So you explicitly mentioned that, I mean, you're not looking into or you're starting to look, or in the long run, you want to look at this these issues, but. My question is, I was somehow triggered when you said on this slide that you train your model on millions of possible combinations. So to me, I mean, with some of colleagues who are present here, so, I mean, we worked with some honeybees use cases when, biologically plausible learning is done on just few examples. So can you comment on this? I mean, the suitability of choosing this transformer model as a model of the brain.
Mhm. You mean considering how they learn?
Yeah, considering how many samples you actually need to learn this predictive model.
Well, we don't really know how many samples humans would take, or maybe other animals would take, to learn to to solve this task at the level of generality that we want them to do. That's one thing. Like, for example, in mice, we don't know how well they can generalize across environments to environments. A lot of the experimental work that we see, the mouse is trained in a single environment or a simple environment with several variations, right? So if I were asked in terms of how many samples realistically humans would require, I would not be able to make a correct prediction, but I could probably say that they would not require tens of millions of examples, right? But how can we do that without giving it that many examples? There might be ways in these models that we haven't really fully explored that you could reuse some of the experiences in different ways, like the theories that people have about replay. You might be able to generate hypothetical or imagined experiences based on what you have experienced so far, right? We don't have good models of how to do that. So instead, what we do is that we ignore that side of the problem and we say, let's say we can generate any example that we want. Would the end state of the model have any capacity to predict neural activity or solve this task in a general way? It's kind of, I would understand if you criticize me for it, because it is more of an engineering approach of getting to a solution rather than maybe a neuroscientist approach of getting to a solution. So far, what I see in computational neuroscience, or at least the subspace, subdomain of computational neuroscience that we are working in, to me, it sounds like it might be a good idea to try to get to any answer and then try to make your way back understanding how the answer works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Absolutely.
But I
Yes.
would take any criticism that you have on
No,
learning.
no, actually, no. It wasn't an idea to criticize in any way. So it's more of a reflection. I now wrapping up this seminar today because I see so we're um, uh, bypass the 1 hour time limit. But I think it was really interesting talk and very informative and thought awakening. I think maybe you can, I mean, from your side, you can have a look at our,
Yes, of course.
community to be
I need to
inspired.
read
But
more. Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, definitely it was a really good discussion, and I also want to point out the great attendance from interesting people. So thank you very much, Pouya,
Thank you all.
for the great talk. So
It
there
was
are
a
some
pleasure.
thanks um, in the chat. So maybe so wait a second. I see one question in the chat that you can briefly read. I would be interested in the effect of context on similarity. If the engram is a multi-way binding, then it also depends on context. Well, we could, I think, probably take it offline. So thank you very much, Pouya, once again, and thank you all for attending this webinar. So really a great discussion. Thank you, and
My
see you in
pleasure.
2 weeks. See you in 2 weeks from now. Bye bye, everyone.
Thanks.